We return now to our top stories. The Pentagon's new defence roadmap and trilateral Ukraine peace talks in the Middle East. And here to break all of this down is Daniel Hamilton, President of the Transatlantic Leadership Network. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Good to see you.
And you. Now, the Pentagon says Russia is a, quote, persistent but manageable threat. Is Moscow manageable?
Well, the defense strategy says it's manageable for the United States, but presents a severe threat to NATO's eastern members, which includes Poland. But the thrust of the document says that European allies need to take on the bulk of deterring Russia, including taking over primary responsibility for conventional defense of Europe. That's quite a change, of course, from previous years.
I guess the question is, though, if Vladimir Putin, he's invaded another country, he's threatened to invade others, he's on many accounts been waging a hybrid war with much of Europe. Is the idea of a manageable Kremlin, even for the United States, because everything in a way impacts across the Atlantic, is that a delusion?
Well, I believe it is. I believe Putin and Russia are bent on upending the European security order. And of course, what happens to that order affects everything around the world. And as you say, Russia's a global nuclear power. It's interfering in Africa. It does lots of different things in the Middle East. So it's not just a regional power looking at Europe, but it is focused on aggression in Europe. And for 80 years, the United States has stood fast to stop that. But this document reorders the priorities for the United States. The Trump administration wants to prioritize the Western Hemisphere, homeland security, and the Indo-Pacific. And their basic message on Europe is the allies really need to take over, and that the U.S. would step back considerably from what it's been doing in the last few decades.
On President Putin, Donald Trump this week also inviting him to join this board of peace. Why do we see Mr. Trump consistently appear to give his Russian counterpart the benefit of the doubt?
Well, we can only surmise, but everything that tells us about Donald Trump is he likes strong men. He believes this is sort of a might makes right world. It seems that he divides the world into three spheres of influence, with the U.S. asserting its so-called rights over the Western Hemisphere, China in East Asia, and Russia, unfortunately, across Eurasia and in parts of Europe. And that's a very dangerous way of thinking about the world.
You mentioned the spheres of influence. Of course, this defence strategy builds on the security strategy, which was released by the Trump White House late last year, the one that warned Europe is facing civilizational collapse. Now, based on what we saw in Venezuela, this rhetoric around Greenland, the fact that, for example, also the Pentagon now slashing its role in deterring North Korea, is this another example of these spheres of influence, this desired Western Hemisphere dominance playing out in formal American foreign policy?
Well, one should not really, despite these documents, we should not overestimate that this is a coherent strategy. These documents are written, within the U.S. agencies. I'm not sure the president's even read them. He doesn't tend to do that. And he is, as you see every day, he kind of decides what the priority is at the last minute. So, and then he changes his mind. So one should not read too much into these documents. The documents also have no relationship to budgets. They're not real strategy. It has, if you're going to prioritize something, where's the money? And neither of these documents say anything about that. So it's better to look at where money is going and, the constrictions on that. And here the U.S. Congress plays a major role. They pushed back on the president's documents and asserted all sorts of limits and support for NATO allies last year in the real budget document that was passed also by the president. So, it's a constant battle. One shouldn't read too much into documents like this. One has to look at see what the United States is actually doing. And, on the day-to-day, the U.S. is still very engaged in Europe. It's just that it is creating a lot of anxiety among European allies whether you can still trust the U.S. to be there if you need it.
As you rightly point out, of course, after that security roadmap was released, there was much talk about what that looks like for Ukraine. And then a couple of weeks later, Congress, then the president, of course, signing off on more cash and support for Ukraine over the coming years. That brings me to my next question, because when Washington says more limited support will be delivered to its allies, when it says Europe will take the lead against threats that are less severe for us, but more so for them, what does that mean for the eastern flank and for NATO?
Well, the president made a commitment to the president of Poland that the U.S. would not withdraw its presence in Poland. So in terms of a bilateral commitment, to the extent those commitments mean anything, I think that Poland should be secure, at least in that bilateral.
Do you trust those commitments, those words?
Well, I don't necessarily, but at least you have a commitment that other countries don't. The U.S. was going to reduce its presence in the Baltic states, and the Congress resisted that and put in more support again for the Baltic states. So you can see this tug of war going on in the U.S. The U.S. is going to reduce its troop presence, but the Congress put in a floor of 76,000 troops. It is about 80,000 at the moment. So that's not going to go down too much without a major battle with the Congress. And the U.S. is trying to give up some of its some of the sub-commands within NATO. This is technical, but give the Europeans more of a role within NATO. I mean, Europeans have asked for more of a role within NATO, so maybe that part's not so bad. But if it's done together rather than sort of a shock treatment, surprise, that's about the trust factor. And unfortunately, the president tends to announce these things in a tweet, and everybody else scrambles to understand what he means. And then 3 days later, he says, "Oh, I didn't mean it." So that, unfortunately, is the world we're dealing with at the moment.
And of course, when we talk about European security, we have to talk about Ukraine, and US, Ukrainian and Russian officials have met face-to-face in the Middle East for these talks over recent days. No breakthrough there. Does the fact in your mind that all three parties are sitting around the table, does that suggest progress, or is this kind of a photo op given that Russia's overnight air assaults continue?
Anytime you can get parties to sit together is a good thing, just so you're aware of, you're not undermining the realities on the ground. But there is no indication, zero, that Russia has stepped back from any of its maximal demands. In fact, in recent days, they sort of stepped it up. They are talking about not just the territorial goals that Russia has, that's been the sticking point, but they're referring to Zelensky's government as a, quote, Nazi regime, and that, of course, has to go. We're back to regime change talk here. That seemed to have gone away, but it's back now. And so every time we come up with some sort of arrangement which seems to work with the Ukrainians and the Europeans, the Russians just say no. And so we're really no further along than we have been since Russia invaded Ukraine.
I do want to ask you about some reports of a 10-year plan circulating for Ukraine's recovery that includes a fast-tracked path towards EU membership, the US and the EU pushing to attract $800 billion of funds to rebuild the country. Does this show how serious the West is taking this integration of Kyiv once a deal is struck?
Well, I think it is serious. There are, of course, many problems in the details. Much of that money is a loan, probably, from the EU, since it couldn't agree to seize the Russian assets that are in European banks. So that's part of it. Whether the U.S. comes through with any additional real money is to be seen. The U.S., as you know, signed a different agreement with Ukraine, which provides for investments, but also provides for quite a bit of access for the United States and American companies. So that's a different agreement. And it's unclear in the EU side of things, can you fast track Kyiv's membership without it going through all of the hoops that previous members have had to do? The acquis communautaire, as they call it, is a huge catalog of many, many different kinds of chapters that a country has to agree to. Other countries have been in the waiting line for years trying to finish that, and suddenly Ukraine is jumping the queue. I would argue it's in the EU's interest to help Ukraine do that, but there are questions about corruption still in Ukraine. There's questions: is Ukraine really prepared for EU membership? Some are saying have Ukraine join, but not as a full member, not with veto rights and some issues. So, however it works out, I think it's time to be creative about integrating Ukraine as much as possible into the Euro-Atlantic mainstream. If NATO membership is not on the table because there's no consensus, we have to think of possibilities.
Daniel Hamilton, President of the Transatlantic Leadership Network, thank you as always for your time.
Thank you.
And that's all for World News tonight. Do stay with us here on TVP World for more. I'm Aaron Dahmen. Good night.